There is a hill beside a river, and on that hill, a very long time ago, nothing extraordinary seemed to be happening. Sheep grazed on wild grass. Reeds bent quietly along the water's edge. And yet from this unremarkable place, a story would begin that would eventually reach from the misty forests of Britain to the deserts of Syria, from the cold banks of the Rhine to the sun-bleached shores of North Africa. Tonight, we will walk slowly through that story. We will not rush. We will let the centuries pass the way they actually passed, one quiet year after another, until an empire rose, and then, just as quietly, came apart. Historians believe the story of Rome begins not with certainty, but with legend, and legends often tell us as much about a people's values as they do about their past. The Romans themselves believed their city was founded by a man named Aeneas, a survivor of the fall of Troy, who sailed west after his city burned, carrying his aged father on his back and his household gods in his arms. He came, in time, to the shores of Italy, and his descendants, generations later, would give rise to two brothers named Romulus and Remus. According to the old story, the twin brothers were abandoned as infants near the Tiber, left in a basket that drifted to rest beneath a fig tree. A she-wolf found them, and rather than harming them, she nursed them as though they were her own. A shepherd later discovered the boys and raised them quietly, unaware of the destiny that would one day be attached to their names. As young men, Romulus and Remus decided to build a city of their own, but they disagreed on where it should stand. And in that disagreement, according to the old telling, Romulus struck down his brother, and the city that rose afterward bore only one name. Scholars today do not take this story as literal history. Archaeology tells a slower, quieter tale, one of small hilltop villages on the Palatine Hill gradually growing together sometime in the 8th century before our era, joined by shared markets, shared defenses, and eventually a shared identity. But the legend mattered because it gave the Romans something to believe about themselves, that their city was built by struggle, by hardship, and by a willingness to place the community above even a brother. For roughly 2.5 centuries after its founding, Rome was ruled not by consuls or senators, but by kings. 7 of them, according to tradition, each leaving behind some mark on the young city. One built its first great temple, another laid down its earliest laws. A later king, said to be an Etruscan, brought engineering knowledge from the north, and under his family, the marshy valley between the hills was drained and became the Forum, the beating heart of Roman public life for the next 1,000 years. The final king, remembered by history as Tarquin the Proud, was said to rule through fear rather than consent, and it was the cruelty of his family, particularly an act of violence against a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, that finally turned the people against the monarchy altogether. In the year the Romans would later mark as 509 before our era, the last king was driven from the city, and the Romans made a quiet but momentous decision. They would never again be ruled by a single man. In his place, they would elect 2 consuls each year, sharing power, checking one another, answerable to the people. The Republic had begun. The early Republic was not a peaceful place. Wealthy families, called patricians, held nearly all the power, while ordinary citizens, the plebeians, had almost none. Over the following centuries, the plebeians would win their rights slowly, through strikes, through withdrawal from the city itself in protest, and eventually through the creation of officials called tribunes, whose entire purpose was to stand between the common people and the abuse of power. In time, the laws themselves were written down and displayed publicly on 12 bronze tablets, so that no noble could claim ignorance of them, and no noble could bend them in secret. As the decades passed, Rome slowly extended its reach across the Italian peninsula. It fought the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the rugged mountains to the south, and the Greek cities that lined the coasts of southern Italy. Time and again, Rome lost battles, sometimes badly, yet it rarely lost wars because it possessed something its enemies often lacked: an extraordinary capacity to absorb defeat, rebuild its armies, and return the following season as though nothing had happened. By the middle of the 3rd century before our era, nearly the entire Italian peninsula answered, in one form or another, to Rome. Meanwhile, across the narrow strip of sea to the south, another power had been growing with equal patience. Carthage, a city founded by Phoenician traders on the coast of North Africa, had built one of the greatest trading networks the Mediterranean had ever seen, along with a navy to protect it. It was perhaps inevitable that two ambitious powers, one dominant on land, the other dominant at sea, would eventually collide. That collision came over the island of Sicily, and it opened what history remembers as the Punic Wars, a struggle that would last, on and off, for well over a century. The First Punic War was fought largely at sea, and it forced Rome to become something it had never been before: a naval power. According to tradition, the Romans studied a captured Carthaginian warship in order to learn how to build their own fleet, and within a remarkably short time, they were launching ships of their own. It was a costly war, fought over more than 20 years, but Rome ultimately prevailed, and Sicily became its first overseas province, the first piece of what would eventually become an empire spanning 3 continents. The Second Punic War brought with it one of the most remarkable military campaigns in ancient history. A young Carthaginian general named Hannibal, still in his 20s, led an army, along with a small number of war elephants, over the Alps and into Italy itself, catching Rome entirely by surprise. For more than a decade, Hannibal moved through the Italian countryside virtually unopposed, winning devastating victories at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most catastrophically at Cannae, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were lost in a single day. And yet Rome did not surrender. Its allies, for the most part, did not defect. Its Senate, though shaken, continued to raise new armies year after year, and eventually a young Roman commander named Scipio carried the war to Carthage's own soil in Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home to defend it, and defeating him there at the Battle of Zama. The third and final Punic War ended not with a treaty, but with an erasure. After decades of lingering resentment, the Roman Senate resolved to remove Carthage from the world entirely. The city was besieged, stormed, and burned, its population killed or enslaved, its harbor destroyed, and according to a story told by later writers, its fields symbolically sown with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether or not that final detail is literally true, the message was unmistakable. Rome's rivals could be forgiven once, they would not be forgiven twice. With Carthage gone, Rome turned its attention eastward, toward the Greek kingdoms that had emerged from the fractured empire of Alexander the Great. Macedon fell under Roman influence, then outright Roman control. The great cities of Greece, once the teachers of the ancient world in philosophy, art, and rhetoric, became, one by one, subjects of a power that had, only a few generations earlier, been a modest city of farmers beside the Tiber. Roman generals returned from these campaigns not only with tribute, but with Greek statues, Greek tutors, and Greek ideas, and Roman culture, especially among its educated class, began to absorb the very civilization it had conquered. Yet success abroad did not bring peace at home. As Rome's territory grew, so did the wealth flowing into the hands of its elite, and so did the inequality between rich and poor. Small farmers, many of whom had spent years away fighting Rome's wars, returned home to find their land bought up by wealthy landowners who worked vast estates with slave labor. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, attempted to address this by redistributing public land to the poor, and both, in turn, were killed by political opponents who saw their reforms as a threat to the established order. It was, historians often note, the first time in centuries that Roman political disagreement had ended not in a vote, but in blood, and it would not be the last. In the decades that followed, Rome's armies and its politics became increasingly entangled. A general named Marius reformed the legions, opening service to landless citizens who, in exchange for their loyalty, expected their commanders, rather than the state, to reward them with land upon retirement. This quietly but permanently shifted the loyalty of Roman soldiers away from the abstract idea of the Republic and toward the individual men who led them. Marius and a rival general named Sulla would each, in turn, march their own armies into Rome itself, an act that would once have been unthinkable, and Sulla would eventually make himself dictator, executing his political enemies by the hundreds before, remarkably, retiring from power and allowing the Republic to continue, at least in form. It was against this backdrop of ambition, debt, and shifting loyalty that three of the most consequential men in Roman history rose to prominence together. Pompey, a brilliant and celebrated general; Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome; and a rising politician of considerable charm and even greater ambition, named Julius Caesar. The three formed an informal alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, to advance their interests beyond what the Senate alone would allow them. Caesar was given command in Gaul, and it was there, over nearly a decade of campaigning, that he would build both a fortune and an army fiercely loyal to him alone. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was, by any measure, a staggering achievement and also a brutal one. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of Gauls were killed or enslaved over the course of the campaign, and entire tribal confederations were broken permanently. Caesar wrote his own account of the war in clear, unadorned prose, partly as a record and partly as propaganda, ensuring that Rome would hear of his victories in his own words before anyone else's. By the time the fighting ended, Gaul was a Roman province, the Rhine had become a frontier, and Caesar himself had become perhaps the most famous man in the Roman world. But fame of that magnitude made enemies in the Senate, particularly once Crassus was killed in a failed campaign against the Parthians, and Pompey drifted toward the Senate's camp. Ordered to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar instead made a choice that would echo through history. He led a single legion across a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, a boundary that, by long custom, no general was permitted to cross under arms. In doing so, he declared civil war on the Republic itself, reportedly remarking that the die had been cast and that there could be no turning back. The civil war that followed carried Roman armies across Greece, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain, before Caesar emerged victorious over every rival. In Egypt, he became entangled with its young queen, Cleopatra, whose own kingdom would later play a decisive role in Rome's story. Caesar returned to Rome not as a king in name, for the Romans still recoiled from that word, but as dictator for life in practice, reforming the calendar, expanding citizenship, and centralizing power in his own hands to a degree the Republic had never before permitted any single man. It was precisely this concentration of power that led to his downfall. On the 15th day of March, in the year we now number as 44 before our era, a group of senators, many of whom had once been his allies, surrounded Caesar in the Senate house and stabbed him to death, believing they were saving the Republic from a king in all but name. They were mistaken. Rather than restoring the old order, Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into another, even more destructive round of civil war, one that would end the Republic entirely rather than preserve it. Out of the chaos that followed Caesar's death, two men emerged as the dominant figures of the Roman world. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, barely 19 years old at the time, yet possessed of a patience and political skill far beyond his years. Together with a third partner named Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, and in the purges that followed, thousands of their political enemies were killed, their property seized to fund the wars still to come. For a time, Antony and Octavian ruled the Roman world together, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east, where he grew closer to Cleopatra of Egypt, both personally and politically. But an alliance built on shared ambition rarely survives the absence of a common enemy, and eventually Octavian convinced the Senate that Antony had abandoned Roman values altogether for the luxuries and loyalties of an Egyptian court. War came once more, and it was decided at sea, off the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, where Octavian's fleet, commanded by his gifted Admiral Agrippa, broke the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, and within a year, facing certain defeat, both took their own lives rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. With their deaths, Egypt, the last great successor kingdom of Alexander's conquests, became a Roman province, and Octavian stood without rival over the entire Mediterranean world. He was careful, however, not to repeat his adoptive father's fatal mistake. Rather than seizing power openly, he returned authority to the Senate in appearance, while retaining it firmly in practice, and accepted instead a new title, one carefully chosen for its modesty: Augustus, the Revered One. The Republic in name still existed. In truth, it had quietly ended, and the age of emperors had begun. The reign of Augustus opened a period Romans themselves would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, roughly 2 centuries during which the borders of the empire, though never entirely quiet, were largely secure, and trade, construction, and law flourished across a territory stretching from Britain to Syria. Augustus rebuilt Rome in marble, famously claiming he had found the city built of brick and left it built of stone. Roads, some of which remain visible today, were extended across the provinces, allowing armies, merchants, and letters to move with a speed and reliability the ancient world had rarely known. Over the following century, power passed, sometimes smoothly and sometimes violently, through Augustus's extended family, the Julio-Claudian line, which included figures as different from one another as the cautious administrator Tiberius, the notoriously erratic Caligula, the scholarly and underestimated Claudius, who added Britain to the empire, and finally Nero, whose reign ended in scandal, suspected arson, and eventual suicide, bringing the dynasty founded by Augustus to a close. After a brief and chaotic year in which 4 different men claimed the throne, a new family, the Flavians, restored stability, and it was under their rule that Rome began construction of its most enduring symbol, a vast amphitheater later known as the Colosseum. The following century brought Rome to the height of its territorial power, under a succession of rulers later remembered as the 5 good emperors, men chosen not by blood but by adoption, selected for competence rather than lineage. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent, stretching briefly into Mesopotamia itself. Under Hadrian, a different philosophy prevailed, one of consolidation rather than conquest, visible still today in the Great Wall he built across the north of Britain, marking, quite literally, the edge of the Roman world. And under Marcus Aurelius, a soldier philosopher who spent much of his reign defending the frontiers rather than expanding them, Rome produced one of the most reflective works of ancient literature, written not for publication, but as private meditations to himself in the quiet hours between military campaigns. Beneath the grandeur of emperors and conquests, ordinary Roman life proceeded according to its own quiet rhythms. Aqueducts carried fresh water across dramatic stone arches into cities that, by ancient standards, enjoyed remarkable public sanitation, with running water, public baths, and covered sewers. Markets sold goods from every corner of the empire: spices from India, silk from China, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul. Roman law, still influencing legal systems today, developed increasingly sophisticated principles regarding contracts, property, and the rights of citizens, even as those same rights were denied entirely to the empire's vast population of enslaved people, upon whose labor much of this prosperity quietly depended. Yet even at its height, the empire carried within it the seeds of later difficulty. Its borders were vast, its administration increasingly costly, and its succession of power, never formally settled by law, remained perpetually vulnerable to ambition and violence. In the year 180, the reign of Marcus Aurelius ended, and his son Commodus, a young man far more interested in gladiatorial spectacle than in governance, inherited the throne. Historians have long marked his reign as a turning point, the moment, as one ancient writer put it, when the empire descended, in his words, from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The century that followed is remembered by historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of such profound instability that the empire nearly did not survive it. Over roughly 50 years, dozens of men claimed the imperial throne, most of them soldiers raised to power by their own legions and murdered within months by the same. Meanwhile, the empire's frontiers came under sustained pressure as never before, Germanic peoples pressing across the Rhine and Danube, the resurgent Persian Empire threatening in the east, and for a time, the empire itself fractured into 3 competing states: a breakaway empire in Gaul, a breakaway kingdom centered on the wealthy city of Palmyra in the east, and a diminished Roman core still clinging to Italy and the Mediterranean at its center. Somehow, against considerable odds, the empire held together, largely through the efforts of a series of tough, capable soldier emperors who fought campaign after campaign to reunify its fractured pieces. It was one of these men, Diocletian, who finally imposed a lasting structural solution, recognizing that the empire had simply grown too large for a single ruler to defend and administer effectively. He divided supreme authority between 2 senior emperors and 2 junior successors, an arrangement known as the Tetrarchy, and he reorganized the empire's provinces, taxation, and army along far more centralized and bureaucratic lines, trading some of the old republic's remaining spirit for the raw administrative survival of the state. It was in this reorganized empire that one of the most consequential transformations in its entire history took place, quietly at first, and then decisively. Constantine, who secured sole rule after his own long civil war, became the first emperor to embrace Christianity, a faith that had spent nearly 3 centuries as a persecuted minority religion within Roman territory. Whatever the precise nature of his personal belief, Constantine's political decision reshaped the empire permanently, ending the persecution of Christians, granting the church legal protection and increasing wealth, and setting in motion a process that would, within a century, make Christianity the empire's dominant faith. Constantine also made a decision whose consequences would unfold over centuries rather than years. He established a new capital in the east, on the site of an old Greek city called Byzantium, at the crossing point between Europe and Asia. He named it, modestly enough for an emperor, New Rome, though history would remember it by another name, Constantinople. It was a city built deliberately to rival old Rome itself, with its own forums, its own senate, its own grand palaces, and in time, it would become the wealthiest and most secure city in the entire Roman world, long after the original Rome had fallen into decline. By the close of the 4th century, the practical division between East and West, which had begun as an administrative convenience, hardened into something closer to permanence. 2 separate imperial courts governed what had once been a single state, and while the eastern half, wealthier, better defended, and closer to Constantinople's secure position, would endure for another 1,000 years, the western half faced mounting pressures that it was steadily losing the resources to resist. Beyond the Roman frontier, meanwhile, a great and largely invisible migration was underway. Germanic peoples, the Goths among them, had for generations lived in uneasy contact with Rome, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, sometimes as both within the same decade. In the later 4th century, this balance was violently disrupted by the sudden arrival of the Huns, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppe whose ferocity and mobility terrified Goth and Roman alike. Fleeing the Huns, vast numbers of Goths sought refuge within the empire itself, and Rome, overwhelmed and unable to absorb or properly provision them, mistreated the refugees so badly that desperation turned to open rebellion. That rebellion culminated in the year 378 at the Battle of Adrianople, where a Roman army, along with the Eastern Emperor Valens himself, was annihilated by the very Goths the empire had failed to protect. It was, in the words of historians who study it still, one of the most consequential defeats in Roman history, a clear signal that the legions which had once seemed invincible could now be broken decisively by the peoples beyond the frontier, peoples who, in growing numbers, no longer stood only outside Rome's borders, but increasingly within them. Rome itself, the city that had once ruled the known world, had not been threatened by a foreign army in nearly 8 centuries. That changed in the year 410, when Alaric, king of the Visigoths, whose people had spent years negotiating, fighting, and being betrayed by Roman authorities in turn, led his forces into the city and allowed them 3 days of plunder. The sack was, by the standards of ancient warfare, relatively restrained, churches were largely spared, and mass slaughter was avoided, yet the psychological shock across the Roman world was immense. Saint Jerome, writing from far away, described himself as unable to speak for grief, saying that the city which had taken the whole world had itself been taken. The decades that followed brought further losses rather than recovery. Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, seizing the rich agricultural provinces that had long fed the city of Rome itself, and later crossed the sea again to sack Rome a second time, in 455, with considerably less restraint than Alaric had shown. Meanwhile, the Huns, under their famous leader Attila, swept through Gaul and into Italy itself, turning back only after negotiations, according to tradition, with the Bishop of Rome, before Attila's death shortly afterward brought the brief and violent unity of the Hunnic Empire to an end. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Emperor was, in practice, a figurehead real military power having passed into the hands of Germanic generals who commanded what remained of the Western legions, many of whom were themselves of Germanic descent. Provinces that once sent grain, taxes, and soldiers to Rome now answered instead to their own Gothic, Vandal, or Frankish kings, and the Western Empire, though it still nominally existed, had become, in the words of modern historians, an empire in name only, its actual territory reduced to little more than Italy itself. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. In the year 476, a Germanic military leader named Odoacer, serving within the Roman army itself, deposed the last Western emperor, a young boy with the strangely fitting name Romulus Augustulus, echoing both the city's legendary founder and its first true emperor. Rather than crowning himself emperor, Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, informing the Eastern emperor that the West no longer required one. There was no great final battle for the city of Rome itself. There was only, quietly, an ending, an empire that had lasted for centuries brought low not by a single dramatic blow, but by centuries of accumulated strain finally settling, like an old and tired structure, gently to the ground. And yet, in a very real sense, Rome did not entirely end that day. In the East, Constantinople endured, calling itself Roman for another 1,000 years, until its own walls finally fell in 1453. In the West, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman cities, and the Latin language itself lived on, absorbed into the kingdoms that succeeded it, and eventually into the modern languages, legal systems, and architecture of much of the world. The alphabet in which so many languages are still written today, the calendar many nations still follow, the very idea of a republic, of checks on power, of citizenship itself, all trace some part of their lineage back to that small hillside village beside the Tiber. So we come, gently, to the end of this long journey together, from a handful of huts on 7 hills, through kings and consuls, through Hannibal's elephants in the snow and Caesar's crossing of a small and fateful river, through the marble grandeur of the Pax Romana and the slow, aching pressures that finally brought the Western Empire to rest. Empires, like people, rise, endure for a while, and eventually pass, and there is a certain peace in remembering that even the greatest of them were, in the end, simply made of ordinary years, one following quietly after another. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, walking slowly through these long centuries together. Wherever you are listening from, I hope this history has settled gently over you, the way the last light settles over an old and quiet ruin. Rest well now, and I wish you a peaceful, undisturbed night.